so much, Tom.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Francesca, for inviting me to give this talk. I was very flattered and a little bit surprised. I consider myself to be very junior and to still have a lot to learn, so I'm going to do my best. But yeah, this is going to go a little bit outside my comfort zone, this talk. So I'm Thomas Idris Marquand, or Tom. I'm based in the Department of Earth Sciences, and my project is part of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration. It's funded by the National Environmental Research Council, and I'm a member of Clare Hall. And I just put my email there in case anybody wants to get in touch after this talk. It's at the end of the presentation as well. Hopefully, this will start a lot of interesting conversations. Fingers crossed. So I just wanted to start by talking a bit about my background. So, oops, okay, for a second it wasn't letting me change the slide. So I've spent my whole university education at the University of Cambridge. So I did my undergraduate degree here, during which I did 3 research projects that were focused on environmental chemistry, and in particular, I took a bit of an interest in wetlands especially, and spent quite a lot of time thinking about methane emissions. Then in my master's degree, I moved on from wetlands to lakes, although I kind of think of lakes as wetlands with a whole lot more water. In particular, I looked at the chemical processes that happen in the sediments at the bottom of deep lakes, especially Lake Baikal in Siberia. And now I'm doing my PhD, which is part of this broader collaboration that I'm going to talk about in a later slide, which is really all about understanding the production and consumption of greenhouse gases in the Fens. And the whole time I've been supervised by Sasha Turchin. It's a don't fix it if it ain't broke kind of situation. I think she's absolutely extraordinary, and if you don't know her, you should get to know her. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize what I'd like to talk about today. This is going to be a pretty brief talk, but here are the main points. I'm going to start by introducing the Fens. I expect that different people listening will have different levels of familiarity with the Fens. So for some of you, it's going to be old news. Hopefully for some of you, it'll be new and interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges that farmers in the Fens face. And I'm going to talk about the role of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration in hopefully providing some answers to those challenges. I'm going to briefly describe my research without getting too technical, which Francesca told me off for in my original abstract. And then I'm going to give some thoughts on the future of Fenland agriculture. So my work is really about greenhouse gases, so actual agricultural practice is a little bit outside my comfort zone, but I'm going to do my best to give some suggestions on what future agriculture in the Fens might look like. And then hopefully there'll be some time to discuss the things I've brought up. I've just added this to remind me to mention that pretty much all of the problems and solutions that I'm going to be talking about in the Fens are to do with water. Water is going to be the theme of this talk, and probably the theme of the entire Centre for Landscape Regeneration collaboration. So I'm going to try and have water in the back of my mind the whole time, and you should too. So I'm going to start by introducing the Fens. On a very basic level, the Fens are a geographic area, part of the UK, part of England. They're right next door to us. So exactly where the Fens begin and end is a very controversial question. So this is what Wikipedia thinks. This is what the National Farmers Union thinks. And this is from Natural England. And if you stare at these maps for long enough, you'll realize that they don't actually agree about the exact shape of the Fens. But the kind of middle portion is pretty much undeniable. But for example, Natural England doesn't have King's Lynn within the Fens, and the National Farmers Union does. So it's a slightly vague term, which is a source of frustration if you're trying to make sense of it. In particular, I think for a food security audience, the National Farmers Union map is particularly interesting. That dark brown color is all of the grade 1 agricultural land in the Fens. The Fens contains about half of England's grade 1 agricultural land. And grade 1 agricultural land is the most sort of productive. You can grow the most variety of crops on it. So it makes it a really significant food resource. The Fens has quite a complicated history. Here's the oldest map that I found. Not granted, there's probably an older one, but in the time I had, historically the Fens were essentially a huge marsh. So I've enhanced the colors a little bit in this map, and all of that blue area is marshland. In that map, north is to the right and south is to the left, just to make it awkward. Draining the Fens really got started in the 1500s, and early attempts at draining the Fens were not very successful, but eventually Dutch engineers were able to make serious progress draining the Fens using windmill-driven pumps. And there are some original windmills still around in the Fens and some replicas. A lot of the labor early on was done by hand, so a considerable amount of manpower went into digging ditches and building dikes, as well as these windmill pumps. In the early Fens, when they were still wetlands, a lot of the economic activity was about reed harvesting, hunting for birds, eel fishing. So the economic activity in the Fens has changed a lot now that it's mostly arable farming. And here's a later picture. I think this is from around 1900, although Ely Museum isn't very good at putting dates on things. Just showing the sort of level of manual labor that went into turning the Fens from a huge marsh into what they are now, really productive farmland. More recently, since the Industrial Revolution, using windmills to pump water out of the Fens has pretty much died out, and well, completely died out. So in the Victorian period, a large number of these steam-powered pumps were built, and some of the pump houses are still in the Fens today. And nowadays, the pumps are mostly electric, and they look more like this. There are also complex systems of sluice gates around the Fens. It's still very much an environment that is artificially maintained by a considerable amount of pumping. It's something on the order of 16,000 Olympic swimming pools worth of water pumped out of the Fens every day. So it's a pretty major operation. And now the economic activity looks more like this. It's vast expanses of farmland. And here are just some pictures of the Fens just today, just so that you get a sense of them. I grew up somewhere where there's a lot of hills and sandstone cliffs, and the soil is kind of grey-brown. So the Fens for me are a really strange environment. There's something a little bit haunting about how flat and expansive they are. The soil, the peat soil is also remarkably black. It's almost coal black, and it's black for the same reason as coal, in that it's really rich in carbon, which is a lot of the reason that the Fens are so productive, and also the reason that they produce so much greenhouse gas. So because this is a talk about food security, I thought this graphic from the National Farmers Union was particularly interesting. The Fens produce a completely disproportionate amount of the UK's crops, considering what a small area it is, as for the UK as a whole. So in particular, I want to draw your attention to the 33% of England's fresh vegetables grown in the Fens. I mean, it's a huge contribution to English food production, and it's particularly producing the kinds of salad crops that wouldn't grow very well on poor soil. So celery, There's onions that are grown there. There's lettuces, cabbages, kind of a little bit of everything. But some of the crops, some of the vegetables grown in the Fens certainly wouldn't grow so well on the kind of rubbish soil that I grew up near. This is really rich, fertile soil. And in particular, this number at the bottom, 90% of Fens farmland is grade 1 or 2. That's what that refers to. Grade 1 is the sort of most productive category of farmland. So that just gives you a sense that the Fens is a kind of an agricultural powerhouse. It's sometimes called the breadbasket of England. Okay, so there are lots of challenges facing Fenland agriculture. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is some of them, particularly challenges related to climate change. So an obvious one is sea level rise and flooding. The Fens are very low lying. Most of the Fens is at or below sea level, and it only remains, the only reason it's not flooded is because water's continually pumped out of the Fens. So this is a map showing which areas of the UK would flood given predicted sea level rise in 2050. And you can pretty much see that map of the Fens recreated in that flooding map. Flooding is also due to variable input from the rivers that feed the Fens. It's not all about sea level rise, but both issues are intimately linked because it becomes increasingly difficult to drain the Fens as the sea level rises, just because of the basic problem that water won't flow uphill. If the sea level is higher than the water level in the Fens, then it won't drain out to sea. Drought is also a major problem facing the Fens, which seems like a contradiction given that flooding is such a major challenge. The real problem is that in order to irrigate crops, you really want water from above that drains through the soil. You'd think that raising the water table might help with the drought problem, but actually most crops can't survive having their roots completely waterlogged. So you have to keep the water table low, but equally if it doesn't rain, then you have problems with drought. This seems like a contradiction, but the Fens can be simultaneously at high risk of flooding and in drought. And it's a major problem. And then the problem that I'm most interested in personally is problems with the soil itself. So the soil is eroding, which is a byproduct of it not having a sort of permanent cover of vegetation as it might have done in its natural state. But additionally, the soil loses a lot of carbon from greenhouse gas emissions, and it's emitting considerable amounts of CO2 and in places methane as well, which are both powerful greenhouse gases. So how does the Centre for Landscape Regeneration come into this? Well, the Centre is a fairly large collaboration. It's an interdisciplinary collaboration, mostly people based at the University of Cambridge, but also some people from the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology and from the RSPB. The collaboration is bringing together people who are interested in very different things. So hopefully these colors here kind of make sense and show you just how wide the scope is of the Centre. So we're trying to take a very interdisciplinary approach to solving some of these problems in the Fens that isn't just about one issue. So it's not all about greenhouse gases, even though my bit is. It actually takes into account things like employment for people living in the Fens, profitability for farmers, introducing new green industries possibly. So it's trying to take and of course, protecting the Fens biodiversity and hopefully improving the Fens biodiversity. It's trying to take into account this really wide range of different issues with lots of different people involved. And the directors of the project are Emily Shuckburgh and David Coombs, who are on that diagram with slightly bigger circles. And there's me, just one tiny bit of the project. The Centre is not working alone. Actually, this is not all the collaborators, but I just put as many as I could fit onto the slide. I tried to make them bigger if they're sort of more connected, but don't take that as gospel. But here's a selection of the various other organizations that the Centre is working with. And this doesn't include things like community outreach, talking to individual farmers directly. On the social sciences side, there'll be a considerable amount of sort of surveying individual people living in the Fens and collecting different people's viewpoints. So it's a pretty massive collaboration, really. Hence why I feel slightly underqualified to fully describe it. So I'm going to go back to where I feel safe and comfortable and talk a little bit about greenhouse gases in soil. So here's my little cartoon of some soil in the Fens. I've put some plants at the top, and this light blue represents the air, the atmosphere. In a sort of brown, I've put a layer of soil, and the darker color represents the waterlogged soil. It's not a different kind of soil, but this is the bit where it's fully saturated with water. And importantly, this boundary is the water table. And I'm going to talk about the water table a lot, so it's just worth clarifying exactly what I mean. It's the boundary in sort of vertical space between the soil that is not waterlogged and the soil that is fully saturated in water. But the soil above might still be wet, just not completely saturated. So there are microbes that live in the soil. I'm sure that's a kind of familiar idea, and it's slightly different microbes that live in the waterlogged soil versus the non-waterlogged soil, and they're doing slightly different things. The plants that grow on the soil are inputting organic matter into the soil, and the fenland soil is very, very rich in organic matter. That is the blackness of the soil. It's that carbon that's inputted to the soil from plants, both from their roots and from dead plant matter that degrades, and there are some other ways that plants also introduce organic matter to the soil. In the shallow part of the soil, where it's not fully waterlogged, microbes convert that organic matter to carbon dioxide, CO2. In the deeper part of the soil, the microbes use a slightly different chemical process and convert the organic matter primarily to methane. And that methane diffuses or even bubbles up through the soil. The shallow microbes convert a little bit of that methane back to CO2, but a large amount of it escapes to the atmosphere. And that really is the mechanism by which the fenland soil is giving off large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. And just as a reminder, CO2 and methane are both really important greenhouse gases. I should say important, not important. And this is really my area. So my hope is that by taking a lot of soil samples and performing chemical analyses on them, I'll put numbers on all of these different arrows, and probably a few extra arrows that I've skipped off this diagram, and hopefully relate that to things like the water table depth, the temperature, maybe the different types of plants that are grown or different types of farming techniques that are used. Hopefully it's you can kind of get a sense that if you raised the water table, you'd have more space that was waterlogged and producing methane, and less space that was not waterlogged and producing CO2. So as you raise the water table, you switch from more CO2 to more methane and less CO2. Or vice versa, if you lower the water table, you produce more CO2 and less methane. So there's a kind of balancing act in terms of how much of each greenhouse gas you produce. And that leads to diagrams like this. So in the first graph, that's just showing a deeper water table leads to more CO2 emissions. In the second graph, it's showing a deeper water table leads to less methane emissions. And in the third diagram, it's showing a kind of balance of those two things, where the dark black line is the sort of overall net greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that there, at least in this analysis, which hopefully I'll do some similar things and maybe get some more East Anglian Fen specific data, you can at least see that there seems to be a kind of sweet spot where the water table's just at the perfect height to be emitting as little greenhouse gas as possible. And in fact, in this particular graph, it actually looks like it's drawing down some greenhouse gas, which would be brilliant if that's something that we could actually make happen in real life. So that's really where my research interest lies in this. And that leads me to think about the future of fenland agriculture along a kind of continuum between a low water table system where you have high CO2 emissions and low methane emissions, to the opposite end of the spectrum where you have high water table, low CO2 emissions and high methane emissions. And you can plot different kinds of land use or farming techniques along this line. So you might think about the kind of farming practices that are currently dominant in the fens, which involve having the land drained and the water table very low. You might think about managing that water table, perhaps raising it when you're not growing crops, so then you can have as much time as possible with a high water table. You can also think about different types of farming, so allowing the water table to be higher, growing grasses and grazing livestock like cows, although accounting for that, the greenhouse gas accounting is slightly more complicated because the cows themselves are then a source of greenhouse gases as well. On one extreme end, you might think about paludiculture, which involves growing plants that are resistant or actually prefer to live in waterlogged soil, things like reeds, which you might then burn for biofuel. And somewhere in there, the most extreme option also sits, which is to completely convert farmland into a nature reserve. I don't think, well, I'm not going to speak for anybody else. Personally, that doesn't feel like the best option when the fens is such an important food resource, so integral to the UK's food security, particularly with it producing a third of England's vegetables. Taking what is really productive land that is so important for our food output and turning it into nature reserve feels like maybe not the most sensible option to me personally. But all of these things are things that the collaboration as a whole can consider. And actually, this is not an exhaustive list of the possible things you might do with the fenland land. This is just some suggestions. These are not the only things to think about. So like I said, I think about greenhouse gases a lot. Other things that the collaboration as a whole will think about is how are these things profitable for farmers? What kind of subsidies are required? Do they create job opportunities for local people? How will these things respond to some of those climate challenges like drought or flooding? How much food do they actually produce? And also, what are the implications for biodiversity in the fens? These are also not the only solutions for the fens that we need to think about. We also need to think about other ways of managing water, things like flood defenses. Anglia Water currently has proposals out for 2 new reservoirs in the fens, which would be a place to store water pumped out of the fens, but also a way to provide more water for irrigation to combat drought. So those reservoirs might answer the problem of additional floodwater storage and also new green industries. So there's scope, for example, to have more renewable energy production in the fens. You could raise the water table and then place solar panels raised above the ground over that land so that it was also profitable while minimizing the greenhouse gas emissions. So just to summarize them, the fens are a really important landscape, and for this talk, it's important to emphasize that they're really important for the UK's food production. The fens are at risk in a wide variety of ways from climate change, but they are also a cause of climate change in that they emit around about 8 million tons of carbon per year as greenhouse gases. The Centre for Landscape Regeneration is hopefully going to provide some answers, evidence-based answers to some of these challenges and come up with real practical recommendations for how the fens should be managed. My part of it is really looking at the greenhouse gas emissions. They're highly dependent on water table depth. That's not the only factor, but that's probably the most important factor in the fens that controls the greenhouse gas emission. and future agricultural practices which will raise the water table may be the solution to solving the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. But certainly there are other things that we need to think about in terms of protecting the land from flooding and drought and providing job opportunities. And water is really central to all of this. Almost everything that we're thinking about in the Fens, including thinking about biodiversity, it's not just the farming side of it, tends to boil down to how are we managing water in the Fens. So thank you very much for listening. Please do keep in touch if you have any thoughts or if you want to work together on something. I'd really appreciate it. I'm quite new to this, so definitely looking for contacts. And like I've said, I'm just one small part of this. Please do have a look into the Centre for Landscape Regeneration if you're not familiar with it already. There are people looking into pretty much every possible aspect of the future of the Fens, so there'll be somebody who shares your interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was really an excellent presentation, actually. May I ask before I open up? Martin is clapping, David is clapping. Likewise, I would say the same. Very quick question. Are all the Fens the same? And therefore, around the world, have you been comparing other realities, and is there anything that we can learn, say, from the Netherlands, for example? And the other question that I wanted to ask is, could the water, even if it raises, could the water be used for irrigation of adjacent lands and be redirected?
Yeah, so okay, so the first question is it how variable is the Fens? How does it compare to Fens around the world? Certainly we think, and I think, that the East Anglian Fens are a really good case study for similar landscapes, drained wetlands all around the world. There are lots of different factors that affect things like greenhouse gas emissions or what kind of crops you can grow there, things like temperature, things like how much rainfall there is, how much of the water is river input versus how much is rain. So it's quite complicated, but hopefully we'll, over the next 3 years, be able to develop some quite fundamental understandings of the processes that affect the fenland ecosystem so that we can then apply that to other places. And there is similar research happening in the Netherlands that I think some people in the collaboration, maybe me, I haven't really thought about it, will also be collaborating with people in the Netherlands looking at similar things. It's definitely a similar environment. Sorry, what was the other question? I rambled too much.
The irrigation using...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the irrigation thing feels like it should be really easy, because you feel like if you're pumping lots of water out of the ground, then you should just keep it and use it for irrigation. I think the problem is infrastructure. The infrastructure to store all of that water is not in place right now. So when the water table is too high, you pump a lot of water out of the ground to prevent flooding, and there's nowhere to keep it, so you have to have it drain away to the ocean. Mm-hmm. The idea of these 2 new reservoirs, or one of the ideas of the 2 new reservoirs, is that some of that water during times where there's a high flood risk would be kept and then reused for irrigation by storing it in these reservoirs. But yeah, the infrastructure is just not there right now to do that.
Could a series of channels be a possibility? Then
yeah, so they do have. I mean, there is a series of channels across the Fens. It's a sort of on a sort of farm scale. That's how you see the drainage. It's all ditches along the edge of the fields, and you can draw water out of those and then spread it over the fields. And that definitely is something that it's not impossible. But as you take the level down. As you take the water level down in the channel, you also lower the water level in the field, because the field drains into the channel. So there's this sort of loop there where you can end up lowering the water table quite a lot by removing water from the channel. So everything's a little bit of a complicated balance in that regard. And I do think that having those two new reservoirs, if they go ahead, they're in public consultation stage at the moment, would probably make a massive difference to that strange issue of drought and flooding being problems at the same time.
Yeah, find a balance.
Yeah.
I have more questions, but I want to let others obviously to make comments and ask their own questions. Please, anyone would like to ask anything to Thomas? Thomas, do you want to close? I can't see everyone.
I had a quick
David.
question. No one else is jumping in. Yeah, so it's a very, very naive question. I don't know much about this area at all, but how different is sort of the Fenland situation in terms of carbon dioxide and methane emissions to non-wetlands? Like does all soil like emit some carbon dioxide, or net emitter of some carbon dioxide and some methane, or is it unique to wetlands?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. I think, I mean, globally, soils store a lot of carbon. Like there's much more carbon in soils than there is in the atmosphere, and it gets into the soils mostly from plants. It's plant matter that falls into the soils, or roots that are already in the soil. The plant dies, and then that plant matter which contains carbon is stuck in the soil. And so the degree to which a particular soil is an emitter or a sequestration of carbon depends on how much plant productivity there are, things like water table depth. It also depends on the temperature. It can depend on what types of plants as well, because some things degrade very easily and some things can tend to build up in the soil. So it's quite a complicated question. And I think it's hard to make a general statement. Some soils are greenhouse gas sources and some are sinks.
Thank you, Dave, for your question. Anyone else? Martin, please. Martin, we can't hear you. I don't know if the others, but I can't hear you.
It's really quiet.
Yeah.
Talk. I was just wondering about the paludiculture and sort of fantasizing a bit. I didn't know how imaginative people have been. You'd think that a marshy ecosystem could be the most productive. And I mean, I don't know, are there people thinking radically about fish farming options, or even this may be completely wacky, and growing crops like rice? I know rice grows up to 3,000 meters in the Himalayas, so there are some cold hardy. Is anybody thinking like that about what you can do with paludiculture? Yeah,
I think they are. You know, this is going slightly beyond my area of expertise in this, but yeah, I think at we're quite early in this broad sort of research program, and I think kind of everything's on the table right now. I mean, the thing that I thought of was cranberries, but somebody who knows more about crops is going to tell me why that doesn't work. But I think there's a real wide range of different options on the table right now, from things that seem very sensible to things that maybe on the face of it seem quite crazy. There are currently ongoing trials in the Fens testing different paludiculture crops. I know that they tried growing sphagnum moss for biofuel, and that didn't work. It's not the right environment for sphagnum moss. But there's a lot of effort going into trying to demonstrate that you can grow reeds for biofuel at the moment. But yeah, I don't see why they couldn't be exploring other types of crops. From my perspective, at least, that sounds sensible to me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we have explored also the possibility of aquaculture, right, Thomas? So
oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Now you're in touch with David.
That.
Yes, that could be another.
Yeah, definitely. I think at this stage, all ideas are on the table. That later on in the process of sort of developing actual policy suggestions, I think some realism and some just general inertia will kick in, and maybe some of these slightly more radical ideas might be thrown out on the basis that that's too much of a leap. Because, you know, in the end, a lot of this is about working with farmers, right, who are already managing the fens. And one of the really important jobs, I think, of the collaboration is to understand what people in the fens, people who have a stake in the fens, feel like they want to see out of the fens, you know, and what they're comfortable with, and, you know, what they see as the kind of option space. But yeah, at this stage, crazy ideas are definitely good.
Kostya, please.
Hi, thank you. It was a really interesting talk. And I just wonder, maybe I missed that from your talk, but I wonder what proportion of fens is currently in arable agriculture, what proportion is paludiculture, how much of it is a kind of natural reserve. Are there any figures? Are you aware of the figures, and whether during the past, let's say, I don't know, 5-10 years, whether there was a trend for change to one or another type of agriculture in fens?
That's a really good question. That might be one to send me an email about, and I'll find those numbers. Those numbers exist. I mean, it's the fens is pretty much dominated by arable agriculture at this stage. I don't think paludiculture makes up any significant proportion, apart from some sort of kind of experimental areas. I mean, there's a sort of, there's some
of it
non-negligible amount. So yeah. So there are some. So the RSPB manages a few areas of sort of bird, you know, wildlife reserve. There's Wickham Fen, which is a sort of attempted rewilding project. Yeah, so there are some areas that are like that. I don't think they make up they're not an enormous part of the fens, so it really is mostly agricultural. But yeah, there are a few. I could probably, I'm sure those numbers exist. I could find them if you want. I just don't know them off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Emma, I've seen that you left a question in the chat. Would you like to ask her, or would you like me to ask?
I'm in a little bit of a noisy environment, so if you could ask it, please, that would be wonderful.
Yes, of course. Thomas, so the two quick questions. Political level, have events like Brexit and the war in Ukraine massively impacted the role of the fens relative to national food security? That's the first one.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay. That's a really tough question for me. I feel like I'm stretching my area of expertise a little bit there. I mean, certainly I would say that one of the things about the fens that makes it so important and so worth investing time and money into is that it is British food production on a considerable scale, including growing a lot of crops that you can't grow very easily elsewhere. So it definitely does have a kind of national food security role. I would be interested certainly to ask farmers, or to ask one of our sort of farmer liaison people to talk to farmers about that. You know, do they feel a kind of sense of pressure to produce more, to counteract the kind of food supply challenges that we've been facing? I suspect the answer would be yes, but yeah, that would be something really interesting to ask them.
That would be certainly a really interesting aspect. And also, following from my first question, if you think that we could take even a more holistic research collaboration approach in relation to wetlands in the role of, you know, ecosystems and economies for the Northern Hemisphere.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of us in the Centre for Landscape Regeneration hope that what we're doing will form a kind of an example, a starting point, a foundation to really build off of and think about wetlands and drained wetlands in agriculture more generally across the world. Yeah. So I definitely think there's capacity for that. This research is quite early, right? So to some degree, the fens are forming a sort of jumping off point for us to start thinking about these things in a more holistic way, right? This collaboration is unusual in that it brings together, sociology with computer science, with chemistry, with earth sciences. So definitely taking a holistic view is something that we're pushing for.
Is there scope, Thomas, to build more elements onto the research, onto the program, as as you go along?
Maybe, or certainly there's scope to collaborate with other research organizations, with other bodies, other researchers. I mean, the collaboration has a certain amount of funding that it got to fulfill its brief, which is essentially to look at the fens, and then actually the fen part of the project is for 3 years, and then they're also going to be looking at the Cairngorms and Cumbria, as well as other environments that we need to think about how we manage them in the future. But because it's it has a brief, it has the funding for that. Where we take it is kind of up to us, but really ought to stick to the original brief that the funding came with. But definitely, I think people within the collaboration would be very keen to think about working with people in other environments, definitely.
Because I guess you can always bring in more funding covering other areas that can complement what you've been doing with this funding.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
definitely.
make a bigger holistic thing. I have Darag and then David again. Darag, please.
Hi, how's it going? I have two questions that aren't really related, but the first one I was just wondering, you mentioned, continued agriculture and farming on these lands, but in terms of like soil erosion, how many years left do you think? Is there any prediction as to how long is left until basically all of that quite rich organic material is totally eroded? Because I was in Peterborough recently and I saw how far down it's come in the last 150 years. It's a couple of meters, which is crazy. And even if you did find a way to balance this methane carbon release by, I guess, re-wetting some of the land, would the erosion not continue if you were just using these ordinary agricultural practices? So that was one of the questions. And the second question isn't related, but I do work on sphagnum and peat bogs. And I was just wondering, do you have any idea how the two environments compare in terms of carbon and methane release? And do you think it's based off the plant litter itself, or do you have any idea of that kind of stuff? So sorry, they're not really related, but I'm just really very intrigued.
Yeah, the second question's good. That one brings it really back to my wheelhouse. The first question is about, the soil erosion. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, raising the water table but continuing to farm is not going to stop soil erosion. It's kind of a separate problem. I mean, actually, a lot of the lowering, the depression in the fenland has come from the drainage. So when the wet soil expands compared to the dry soil. So as you dry it, it kind of shrinks down. So actually those very earliest, when I was talking about the history, those earliest slightly failed attempts at draining the fens, the reason they failed is because of the amount of subsidence they caused. I think the greatest subsidence in the fens is sort of around 6 meters over the last 200 years. So it's pretty big, especially when you're starting at essentially sea level. So then you're moving it another 6 meters below sea level. And soil erosion makes that all a whole lot worse. I think the solutions to soil erosion are going to be about, again, it's not really my area, but I think it'll come down to plant cover and, having cover crops or, clover cover or something during the non-growing season, right? So that there's still some kind of root mass holding the soil in place. But yeah, I don't think raising the water table will solve that problem. Certainly any kind of like developing nature reserves or anything like that, I mean, that definitely will help, right? Because then you have considerable plant cover that holds the soil in place. As for the comparison to peat bogs, the big difference is where the water comes from. So fens in general, so we're talking about the fens with a capital F. Fens in general as a type of wetland are fed by rivers principally, not by rain. So the water that's coming into the fens is much more mineral rich and somewhat more nutrient rich than water that's coming into peat bogs, which tends to mean that the plant life is more productive. So it's actually sort of, the soil's almost too good for sphagnum. It's not nutrient poor enough. The effect of that, and also the fact that the water table in a natural fen is not usually sort of at the surface, it's usually slightly below, means that natural fens tend to be greenhouse gas sinks, slight greenhouse gas sinks. Whereas, I mean, my understanding is that with peat bogs, they're usually a slight source because of the amount of methane that they release. With fens, there tends to be more of a kind of buffer in which methane is oxidized, and they tend to come out when you account for all that as a slight greenhouse gas sink. And very different species grow. So the fens naturally would be covered in reeds, irises, long grasses, bulrushes. It's quite an interesting environment in terms of the species that live there compared to bogs, which are moss dominated. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting, and makes sense in terms of the river water. I never thought about that. I always kind of thought
Right.
about the plants rather than the source that's feeding them. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
We should talk some more sometime about it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'm very interested in peat bogs as well. I do think the fens slightly win in terms of being beautiful because I'm a real sucker for those wild irises. There's two species of native irises that are really beautiful.
Yeah, the boglands are just pretty sparse, right? There's just nothing, just flat lands.
Yeah, exactly. It's another level of bleak.
Yeah.
Thank you, Darek.
Yeah, thank you.
Darek, you are in biochemistry, right?
Yes, I'm the Dupree lab.
Sorry.
Okay.
So we're looking at the sphagnum structure, the carbohydrate structure of these types of plants, which obviously is the carbon source that we're talking about, is the carbohydrate. So yeah.
Oh, maybe
Right.
I can rope you into the seminar as well, Darek. Watch out. David, you raise your hand, please.
Yeah, just a quick one. Might be impossible as well, but from as it currently stands, from a purely sort of carbon/methane emission perspective, do you have any sort of relative benchmark against other sources of carbon emissions? Like how bad is it basically compared, contextualized with transport and things like that?
Yeah, not that bad. So in terms of the UK's total emissions, the most recent number I saw was 440 million tons of carbon, something like that. So the fens produce around. This is something that we as a collaboration need to refine these numbers because they're not very good estimates. I don't think. I don't trust them that much. But it's around 8 million tons of carbon. So it's about 2% of that total number. So it's significant. It's surprising. I was surprised by how significant it was when I first started getting interested in the fens. But it's certainly, I mean, it's far less than, say, the total amount of emissions from cattle. It's considerably less than that. It's not on the same scale as sort of total transport emissions or anything like that. But in terms of the emissions that come from farming, say, an onion in England, it adds a lot. Those emissions from the fenland soil add a lot to how much emissions come from a particular vegetable. It's significant in that sense, but yeah, it depends what you compare it to, I guess.
And one tiny follow-on is then, you might have stated it clearly, but on the trade-offs between like carbon and methane emission, what is from a purely carbon perspective, the optimal use of the land, like in the optimal height of the water table? Like, yeah, what was the best case scenario? I know there was a net sink at some level, but is that what you would sort of instinctively recommend?
No.
Okay.
I'm skeptical about these numbers. I think this is a really great starting point. This work by Mulholland. It's Barry Mulholland, I think it is. so in this data set, which draws from a variety of different wetland environments, some drained, some not, he does see quite a clear trend. And when you balance them out, it looks like 10 centimeters water table depth looks about right for drawing down the most carbon you can. The reason that I'm slightly skeptical is because there are lots of other things that control the emissions of methane and CO2. The plant type affects it. So plants with sort of large air spaces, things like reeds, when they break, they can provide like almost a straw for greenhouse gases to escape from the soil. Temperature, so methane emissions are pretty strongly temperature dependent. Things like nutrient input to the soil matters. So I'm a bit skeptical that this doesn't necessarily capture all of the detail. Also, just how thick is the peat layer? So in somewhere where the peat layer is very thick, then the water table will cover some of that peat layer. But in places where the peat layer is very thin, the water table may well be fully below the peat layer, not even intersecting it at all. And that really changes the story. So this is a great jumping off point, but I hope that my work will produce something a little bit more detailed where you can say, okay, here's the starting point, but what if the peat layer looks like this? What if the temperature changes like this? What if we grow this crop over that one? It's ambitious, but those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, certainly.
Thank you, David. Ross also wrote in the chat that peat emissions contribute about 4% of the UK total. And I think also Ross has a hand raised anyway. So Ross, if you want to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, I'm just as I'm actually one of the people responsible for that graph. And it's actually from Evans. Mulholland et al. Was another report that came out of the same project. But what we're actually talking about in that particular graph is the water. It doesn't describe just the drainage, it describes and a water level of 1 meter. You've got an effective drainage depth of 50 centimeters. So that's what that's all about. And the other thing to note about that is it's about, I completely understand what you're saying about the temperature and all the rest of it. In that particular analysis, we were looking at annual emissions in relation to water level. Right. So if you, so these relationships all pop out. If you look at the annual emission versus the annual, the annual effective water level depth. And we're definitely not saying that, know there's temperature controls, and we know there's plant mediated transport. Oxford actually going to test some of these relationships.
Sure.
But it is what it that's, you just got to understand what that particular graph shows.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, I didn't have very long to put this presentation together, but yeah, no, it's definitely something I'd love to discuss further. And yeah, I mean, I guess what I hope is that with some more detailed sampling, more detailed time resolution, we'll be able to maybe make some more precise predictions about how, not just in general, how these things relate, but how in specific settings with different parameters, these things relate.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you find.
Thank you, Ross. That's great. I'm afraid we've come to 3 o'clock, and it was really fascinating. Thank you so much, and then thank you so much, Thomas, for putting it together so quickly. It's fantastic, and I'm hoping that you'll make more connections, and I'm obviously happy to help with those connections. Thank you so much, everyone, and I will see you next Friday, I hope. Have a good weekend.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.